Some TDY, temporary duty, assignments can be fun and exciting, but it wasn't. It was 30 days of almost round-the-clock hard work. Every year, the U.S. Army participates in rapid deployment exercises. Several units from across the Army are selected to participate and are airlifted, along with all their equipment, to Germany, where they participate in a month-long exercise with their NATO counterparts. My name is Fred Sadler. At the time, I was a relatively new captain in the U.S. Army and was working in the Operations Division stationed at Fort Hood, Texas. This deployment came at the most inopportune time for me to be anywhere other than at home with my wife, as she was pregnant and the baby was due sometime during this deployment. I tried to leave the service, but the Army would not accept that decision. Lydia and I were married for almost 6 years. Most of them were good. The bad ones happened when I had to leave on a business trip and she stayed home. Lydia and I were not lovers or lifelong friends. We met at the DMV when I was registering my car. She was renewing her license. We sat next to each other, waited for our license plates to be called, and started chatting. One thing led to another, and pretty soon we exchanged phone numbers. A week later, we had our first date, and a month later, our first night together. Lydia wasn't an enthusiastic beauty, but she had a classic look that made my insides flip. She could just look at me and my heart would melt. Her body was classic too. Most men pay attention to any woman with a beautiful body, and I saw the way men and women looked at her as she walked by. At first, I felt proud watching them stare at her, but eventually it got tiresome. I began to think of them as leeches, seeing her only as a sexual object. I realized that was something I would have to come to terms with. Lydia, on the other hand, took it all calmly. "Let them watch, honey," she said. "It's no big deal. As the saying goes, it's okay to look, but it's better not to touch." You bet they better not touch each other, I thought every time she said that. She worked very hard to get her body to look the way it does now. I was helping her. We spent 3 nights a week at the gym, running in the park, hiking. We even watched our diet. I'd already forgotten the last time I'd eaten red meat. Watching her get dressed, or better yet, undressed, was always fascinating to me. Every time she carelessly threw off her clothes, exposing some of her bare skin, my heart raced and I never got tired of it. When the deployment began, I heard my commander say, "I give you a personal guarantee that I will do everything I can to get you home before the baby is born." And he did. He arranged it so that at the end of the exercise, I was on the first plane back to the States. I had packed my things and was about to board the plane. I called Lydia, who told me that she thought she was going to be hospitalized in the next couple of days. "Then the timing must be perfect because I'm already flying home," I told her. We ended the conversation with, "I love you." It was dusk, I was driving to the airport, and a deer ran out onto the road in front of us. My driver swerved to avoid it, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in a military hospital in Frankfurt. I had a broken right arm, right leg, 3 ribs in my side, and a collapsed right lung. I was so stupefied that I did not realize who or where I was. As I began to slowly regain consciousness, I began to ask questions. "How long have I been here?" I asked the nurse. "5 days. Is my wife here?" "No, sir." "Where is she?" "She wasn't here, sir, but your commanding officer notified her right after you arrived, so she knows what happened." "Where's my cell phone?" She found it among my personal belongings, and I called Lydia. "Are you okay?" were her first words. "Never mind about that. How are you and the baby?" She began to cry. "We lost the baby, Fred. I'm so sorry." I was too stunned to speak. Finally, I asked, "Are you okay?" "I think so. I'm home. But they don't want me traveling, or I'd be with you." "What happened?" I asked. "No one knows for sure. Everything seemed to be fine until I heard one of the nurses say, 'Uh-oh.' And that's when everyone got excited. I still don't understand anything, but they tried to explain that it was something with the umbilical cord." "Are you sure you're okay?" I asked. There was a long silence as we both struggled with our thoughts and emotions. "Physically, I'm fine, but emotionally, I'm a mess. When are you coming home?" "I don't know. They haven't given me any ideas." "Do you want me to try to come over?" "No. No. Stay there and take care of yourself." 2 weeks later, I was flown home on a medevac airplane. Lydia met me and traveled with me to Fort Hood Hospital. She was still worked up, but the time together helped us both. I asked her if she had named the baby. Yes, I named her Hope. At those words, we both cried. And I stayed in the hospital for another 2 weeks before I was discharged with limited duty. Limited duty usually meant that you didn't have to go out into the field and train. This was very difficult because my arm and leg were still in casts. It took a few more weeks before they were taken off. Time went on, and everything went smoothly in our marriage and in my career. 2 years after we lost the baby, we were transferred to Heidelberg, Germany. We spent 3 years there, traveling all over Europe. There I was promoted to major. After 3 years, we were transferred to Fort Lewis, Washington. Being a major, we were given field-grade officer quarters. They were much nicer than the company quarters, and they had garages, not just carports. The company class included second lieutenant, first lieutenant, and captain. The field class included majors and above. When we moved to the cabin in Lewis, all the stuff we had taken with us to Germany was shipped back. We unpacked those boxes, as well as the boxes we had stored and not taken with us. The boxes were stacked in each room. Lydia went to the officers' club for a pledge meeting. There, she could meet other wives and make new friendships. While she was gone, I stayed in our cabin unpacking and unpacking. Using a box cutter, I opened one of the many boxes and began taking things out of it. It was the same box we had stored things in while we were in Germany. About halfway down was a small wooden box that I didn't remember seeing before. I placed it on top of the stack of boxes and opened it. My life had changed forever. There lay a small stack of envelopes with a pink ribbon around it. I pulled the ribbon away and picked up the top envelope. It was unsealed, so I opened it. Inside was an official document labeled birth certificate. As I looked at the document, my mind began to fog up. It stated that a baby girl weighing 7 pounds, 6 ounces, and 19 inches long was born alive, and it included the date. It was the same date Lydia had told me our baby was stillborn. The baby was named Hope. It was further reported that the mother's name was Lydia Jane Sadler, née Johnston. Where the father's name was given, there was a notation unknown. At the bottom of the certificate were 2 small inked footprints. Staggering, I literally fell onto the couch and stared at the document for a long time. Leaving it on the couch, I stood up and walked over to the stack of envelopes. I picked up the next envelope. It too was unsealed. I pulled out a multi-page document. It was an adoption certificate. I read it several times. The gist of it was that a child named Hope, born Lydia Sadler, had been given up for adoption and stripped of all parental rights. It went on to say that, since the identity of the biological father is unknown, his authorization is not required. It also stated that the name and location of the adoptive family must remain confidential, and absolutely no contact between the adoptive family and Mrs. Sadler was allowed. I looked through the rest of the packet and it was mostly letters from me. I was in complete shock. This had to be the biggest lie in the history of lies. I couldn't stop asking questions. These things don't happen overnight, they have to be planned. That's what I thought. If she thought I was coming to the birth, then did that mean she was already planning the adoption? Father unknown? If I wasn't the father, who was? Obviously, even she didn't know. We were married for 6 years. How many men had she slept with in that time? Did she know? The thought made me uncomfortable. I managed to regain my composure and put everything in its proper place. I even repackaged and resealed the box that contained everything. As I sealed the box, I saw the inscription, Lydia's Papers and Childhood Memories, written in magic marker on 4 sides. If I had seen that, I definitely wouldn't have opened the box. She must have known that. Even in marriage, we need personal space and thoughts. I rearranged a few other boxes and put the box among them, trying to pretend I hadn't noticed it. I went outside to sit on the back patio and get some fresh air because it was stuffy inside. What am I supposed to do now? How do I even talk about this? I was at a loss. There was no thought in my head about where to go or how to get there. I needed advice. If I went to my parents, they would explode and try to kill Lydia. I was their only child and therefore their only hope. I realized the irony. Hope for a grandchild. I could have gone to her parents, but that prospect didn't inspire confidence. We had no close friends. Military moves and meeting different people were hard on both family and friendships. When she came home, I was still there. She found me on the street. Hi, honey. She kissed my cheek. How much have you gotten done so far? Enough. I said it rather abruptly. I was rarely brief or curt when talking to her, so I could feel her looking down at me. She stayed there for a few more minutes before leaving for the house. It must have been another hour before I entered the house. The box of Lydia's papers and childhood memories was gone. We've been invited to meet on Saturday at the Welcome Wagon. Okay. The Simpsons from Heidelberg are here. Do you remember them? Not really. He was a G2 major and I played bridge with her. Their names were Jim and Fran. Oh yeah, I remember. She walked over to me. Are you okay? Did something happen? Did something happen? I thought. You bet, something happened, and I intend to find out what it is. No, I'm just a little out of sorts today, I guess. Good, what would you like for dinner? Or would you prefer to go to the O Officers Club? I'm not hungry. I think I'll lie down. I did so, fully clothed, on our bed. Sometime before she joined me, I fell asleep. It must have been late because when I looked at the clock, I was still awake at 1 o'clock in the morning. I slept until 9 o'clock, which rarely happened to me. I took a shower and went downstairs. As she was supposed to, she made coffee. Breakfast? She asked. No thanks, just coffee. Another rarity. I usually had a full breakfast. She sat down across from me. Okay, there's something wrong. Tell me, and maybe I can help. I just have a lot to think about, I said, stood up, took my coffee to the sink, poured it, and headed for the garage. You know I'm here when you need me, she said as I left. I drove up to the golf course, parked the car, and headed to the 19th hole, where there was a bar, diner, and restaurant at the end of the golf course. I ordered 2 eggs over medium heat and corned beef hash. I even had a rare cup of decaf coffee. This used to be my favorite breakfast until Lydia changed my eating habits. Beef in any form or by any name was an absolute no-no for her, but I ordered it anyway. I managed to eat most of it and sit on the deck while the golfers finished the 18th hole and retired to the house. When I got home, it was the middle of the afternoon. She had made significant progress in sorting out boxes and organizing the house. I looked around and wondered what it would be like to have a 5-year-old daughter running around. I barely made it to the bathroom before I lost my scrambled egg glaze. I was still dipping my head into the dresser when I felt her hand on my back. Suddenly, I hated her. Get off me! I almost shouted before I threw my head back and lost another portion of my breakfast. I hadn't thrown up in years, not since getting drunk at my high school prom. Finished, I went upstairs and rinsed my mouth and brushed my teeth. She was sitting in the living room with a napkin in her hand. She looked like she had been crying. She watched me walk past her and head into the garage again. I was backing up when she appeared in the rearview mirror. I can't help you if I don't know what's wrong, she said as I continued to back up. She saw that I wasn't going to stop and moved off. I went to my unit and walked into the office. There was no one there except the officer on duty. I sat down at my desk and tried to work, but my heart wasn't in it. When I got home, it was past midnight. She was lying in bed reading. I undressed and took a shower. I'll sleep downstairs, I announced as I walked out and closed the door. I had just turned on the TV and was getting comfortable on the couch when she walked in, grabbed the remote, turned off the TV, and stared at me. Cut the crap. Tell me what's wrong and I'll either help you or leave. Which was what? I haven't done anything wrong, so I won't tolerate you yelling at me when I'm trying to help, or having to get out of your way when you try to run me down. I walked over to her, took the remote from her hands, and turned the TV back on. Have a safe trip, I said. She left less than an hour later. We'd never talked to each other like that, and she'd never threatened to leave, let alone actually do it. I got up and started looking for the box. I found it in the basement under a few other boxes. I opened it, found a small wooden box, pulled out the birth certificate and adoption papers, made copies of them, and put everything back. Since she was gone, I slept in our bed. Monday morning, I talked to the commander and told him my story. I even showed him the paperwork. He was as dumbfounded as I was. I had been under his command for less than a month, so I hadn't had time to get used to him yet. Perhaps he was worried that he had a loser on his hands. What do you plan to do? He asked me. I'm not sure. Did she say where she was going when she left? No, sir. But she didn't take all her things, especially the box. There was a pause before I spoke again. I was thinking of trying to find my daughter, if she is my daughter, and proceeding from there. That would be next to impossible. In adoption cases, confidentiality is very important to both parties, he said. I understand, but I have to do something. I have to start somewhere, and I don't trust her to tell me the truth anymore. And then I literally jumped up. Oh my God, I have an idea. Can I have the day off? Sure. I saluted and ran out of his office and building and into the parking lot where I got in my car and drove home. I opened the box, pulled out a wooden crate, and dumped its contents on the floor. There was a pacifier in there. A pacifier. Hope must have used it before she was taken. I put the box back together, put the pacifier in a clear plastic bag, and sealed it. I got online trying to find a DNA lab in the area. There was one in downtown Seattle. I went into the bathroom, but all of Lydia's things were gone. I rummaged through the cabinet under the sink, found her old hairbrush, put it in another plastic bag along with the bag that held the pacifier, and hauled ass to Seattle. I held out the pacifier to the technician, whose name was Margie, and she looked at it. It's been a while, so there may not be any DNA left on it, but we can try. She looked at the comb and pulled a few hairs out of it and said there wouldn't be a problem with that. Then she asked me to spit in the bottle. We'll call you in about 3 weeks, she said. I headed back to Fort Lewis and home. Lydia wasn't heard from for another full day. Hi, I said, are you feeling better? Better than what? Better than the asshole you were a couple days ago. No, still the same old asshole. So it's still not safe for me to go home. No, it's not safe. Try again in 3 weeks. Why 3 weeks from now exactly? 7 minutes. I should know by then whether I'm going to kill you or just divorce you. I ended the conversation. Just then the phone rang and I ignored it. The next day when I got home, Lydia was already there. She met my car when I pulled up in front of the house. She was furious. What do you mean you're going to either kill me or divorce me? Exactly what I said. I think I deserve an explanation, she said. So do I. About what? She asked. We were still standing in the driveway. Not that we were yelling, but we were clearly not behaving the way an army officer and his wife are supposed to behave. So you don't need to explain anything? I asked. That's exactly what I'm saying. So there's no hope for us, I said, putting as much emphasis as possible on the word hope. What do you mean there's no hope for us? What did I do? And then it hit her. Oh my God, no, please, no. I'll be back in an hour, and you'd better not show up here. I'll leave for work in the morning at 6:30. I'll be back at 5. By then all your stuff should be out of this house. I left. Came back exactly an hour later and she was gone. And the box, and some of her things too. She tried to call that night, but after the first call, I blocked her number. The rest of the night passed quietly. At exactly 6:30 a.m., I was in the car and opening the garage door. There was Lydia standing in the rearview mirror again. I slowly backed up. It was very tempting to hit her, but I restrained myself. Can we at least talk? She asked as I continued in reverse. Please? Her hands rested on the trunk lid, and she moved backward with the car. I didn't answer anything. A van was parked outside, with 3 men sitting in the cab. I was halfway there and the car was still moving. I saw the men get out of the van, run up to her and pull her out from behind my car. I didn't know whether to be happy or sad that they did that. When I got home in the evening, the house was almost empty. She had picked out almost all the furniture and carted it away. True, she left my favorite chair and a bedroom set for guests. She also left the everyday dishes and a few pots and pans. She took the good silver and china and other stuff I had no interest in. The next morning, I called my office to let them know I would be late. I then called Post Housing and arranged for government furniture to be temporarily brought to my apartment. I also called the credit union, our stockbroker, the insurance company, and anyone else I could think of and went about the mundane things that are usually associated with divorce. Then I made an appointment with a JAG, Judge Advocate General, Army lawyer. I knew they were not authorized to represent me in civilian court, but they were able to advise me. They confirmed what I suspected. She would get half. We lived in public housing, so we didn't own a house, but we had enough money to buy one if we wanted to. Both our cars were paid off. We bought them in Germany for much cheaper than we would have paid in the States for the same cars. I went to my office. My commanding officer talked to me for a while and told me to use whatever reasonable time I needed to get in shape and to keep him informed of my progress or lack thereof. My life continued for another couple weeks. I went to work, did chores, mowed the lawn, washed and cleaned my car. One morning, the phone rang. Hello, I answered. Is this Major Fred Sadler? Yes. Major Sadler, this is Margie from the DNA Analysis Center. A few weeks ago, you gave us some samples to analyze. Yes, I did. Well, the results are in and you can come in and look at them. Can't you just tell me that now? No, sir, I can't. We can either mail them to the address you gave us, or we can show them to you in person. We have no way to verify over the phone that you are who you say you are. We have to see identification. We can mail the results because, as you recall, we asked for your ID when you were here and were able to verify your address. I'll be there as soon as I can. I walked through their door, introduced myself, and asked to get Margie. She came out and we shook hands. She asked to see my ID. Come with me, please, she said. I followed her into a small room. She asked me to wait. She left and came back a couple minutes later. She handed me a pacifier and then said, Sample A is yours. Sample B is from the hair you gave us. And Sample C is from the pacifier. We were able to determine that samples B and C are positively related. Sample A is not related to either B or C. Thank you, I said, took the pacifier, put it in my pocket, picked up the papers, and left. I got into my car. At least I didn't have a daughter calling some other man daddy, but someone else did. JAG was not authorized to recommend specific law firms or attorneys, but the JAG officer I spoke with was able to provide me with a list of approved attorneys and firms. The next day, I started calling them. I made 6 appointments. At the 3rd meeting, I found my man. He was a retired JAG officer and hated cheating spouses, both wives and husbands. I spent over an hour telling him my story. 45 years I've been practicing law, and this is the most diabolically unprincipled case of selfishness I've ever seen. She must have ice water in her veins where there should be blood. It's a shame that the courts here almost always side with the wife regardless of the circumstances of the divorce. I can almost guarantee they will side with your wife in this case as well. It feels like they have to destroy the husband, no matter how innocent he is. By the time I got home, it was late. There was a letter in the mailbox. It was from Lydia. Fred, the 3 weeks were up. Lydia? Short and to the point. The return address was her parents' address in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. I called her. Hi, Fred, she said. I won't talk about it over the phone, and I'm certainly not flying to Pennsylvania, so I guess you'll have to come here. If you mean Seattle, I'm already here. I sent a letter last week when I was there. I'll be at the house at 6:30. Come by then, I told her. She hung up. I didn't prepare anything special. No drinks, no cheese, no crackers, nothing. This was supposed to be a business meeting. I put the DNA documents and my copies of the birth certificate and adoption papers on the coffee table with the government insignia. She pulled into the driveway at 6:20, but waited until exactly 6:30 to ring the bell. I was in no hurry to answer it. Opening the door, I invited her in and then indicated where she should sit. I sat down on the couch. She sat in the uncomfortable straight-backed chair across from me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a pacifier and held it out to her. She grabbed it and pressed it to her chest. Thank you, she said, as if I had given her $1 million. Then I held out a copy of the DNA test results to her. You already know I'm not the father, but this will confirm it. She reached for the results and took them with her left hand. The pacifier remained clutched in her right. I take it you are sample A? She asked. Yes. Then, without saying anything, I pushed the rest of the papers toward her. She leaned forward, read the title on the top sheet, and tears came to her eyes. She put the DNA test results aside and picked up the dissolution of marriage application. She started to read it, but the tears were already flowing freely and falling onto the form, so she set it aside. She rummaged through her pockets looking for a napkin, but couldn't find one. Can I have a tissue? She asked. I don't have any. That was a lie because there was a box on the nightstand by the couch where I was sitting. She saw them and just stared at me. I didn't move. "You're not making this easy for me, are you?" she asked. "You cheated," I said. She nodded. "How many times?" I asked. "Does it matter?" "No, I just want to know." "One weekend." "With different men?" "Just one." "Who is he?" "Again, does it really matter?" "Again, I just want to know. I think I deserve it." "I'm not going to tell you." "Do I know him?" "I'm not going to tell you." "So you'd rather protect him than try to save your marriage?" She held up the divorce petition. "Our marriage is over anyway. Why ruin it?" "Okay, but you have to tell me why you lied about your daughter being stillborn." It was a statement, not a question. "Yes, I owe you one." She stood up, pulled out a box of tissues, and placed it in front of her. She took one and wiped her still damp eyes. She was still clutching her pacifier. "When I found out I was pregnant, I wasn't sure if it was your baby or his. I thought about having an abortion, but I couldn't. Over time, I was able to realize that you can't know for sure if it's your baby or not. When we found out it was going to be a girl, I was even more sure you wouldn't know because there is a special bond between father and daughter, and I was sure you and her would look alike. As the time of her birth approached, I started to get nervous. Suddenly, you'd find out she wasn't yours. Then you went away on a business trip and my nerves calmed down a bit. I was glad you wouldn't be around when she was born. Then you told me you were flying home, and I started to get nervous again. My emotions were like a roller coaster ride. Maybe you'll know, maybe you won't. Maybe you'll be there when she's born, maybe you won't. I was nervous. And then she appeared, alive and perfect. She was placed on my chest and I looked at her and fell in love. She was beautiful. She had blonde hair and blue eyes. Blonde hair and blue eyes. She paused. The same as her father's. You have brown hair and brown eyes. No one in our families has blonde hair and blue eyes. I knew she wasn't yours. She was my daughter and you were my husband. I loved you both, but I knew I had to choose one of you. I chose you. The hospital staff helped me when I told them I wanted to give her up for adoption. Within 24 hours, I had the paperwork in my hands. They asked who the baby's father was, and I said I didn't know. They said it would be easier that way because if I knew who the father was, they would have to get his permission. I just breastfed her and held her in my arms. She was sucking on a pacifier when they brought me the papers to sign. At this point, she started crying again. They took her away from me so I could sign the papers. I signed and reached out to take her. The nurse said, "You can't take her away. She's not yours anymore." I reached for her anyway, but managed to grab the pacifier before they left with her. I never saw her again. The two pictures I managed to take with my phone, the pacifier, and the birth certificate are all I have left of her. Now she was sobbing. "God forgive me. I want my daughter back." I sat and watched her cry for a long time and then brought her a glass of water. "Thank you," she said. I sat back down. It took her a long time to calm down. I knew I had to tell you something, so I made up a lie that she was stillborn and her remains were cremated. When you came home, I couldn't believe you didn't ask to see the birth certificate, death certificate, or anything else. I still can't believe it. "I trusted you," I said. "I had no reason not to trust you. Besides, it was so traumatic that I saw no reason to add to our suffering by looking at those papers." She continued. "Eventually, you and I got our lives back to normal and I was almost happy, but some part of me was missing. She's still missing, and it gets worse every year on her birthday. I always took the time to pull out her birth certificate, touch her little footprints, and hold her pacifier. There were times when I wanted to take it in my mouth to feel closer to her, but she had some of my dry breast milk on it and I wanted to keep it, so I didn't. At this point, she wanted to show it to me, but it was gone. They must have scraped it off at the DNA lab. Oh my God, it's gone." She groaned, then looked at me. "It's gone. Her milk is gone. You bastard. You took her milk." She fell to her knees and literally curled up in a ball on the floor. She wouldn't stop howling. I picked her up and put her on the couch. I couldn't let her leave in that condition, so I covered her with a blanket and went to the bedroom, but not to bed. She remained there for several hours. At midnight, I heard the toilet flush. I went downstairs. She was sitting on the couch. "Do you want coffee?" I asked. "Asked me?" "Yes, please." She sat down at the counter and I brewed her a cup. She took a sip. I guess I got a little cold feet, huh? Sort of. We sat in silence and drank our coffee. More? I asked. Yes, please, she replied. Sir, where are you staying? I asked, brewing 2 more cups. At a motel. Were you there for more than 3 weeks? No, I was with my parents most of the time. Do they know the truth? No. I lied to them too. I told them that you and I were going through a rough patch and I needed to get away from you for a while. They paid for me to visit them. They think I came back to help sort out our difficulties. Where is your motel located? Just off post. Actually, I should be there by now. She looked around, walked over to the coffee table, pulled a pen out of her purse, sat down, signed the divorce papers without reading, and left. I put the coffee cups away and went upstairs to sleep. When I woke up, it was the middle of Sunday morning. I spent the rest of the day thinking. On Monday, I took the divorce papers to my attorney and he filed them. I went to the housing authority and told them I was moving out of the neighborhood to an apartment out of town. 6 months later, I was divorced. Neither the court nor I heard from Lydia. As a result, she got nothing but her car and everything else she took. A copy of the final judgment was mailed to her parents' address in Pennsylvania. I have thought a lot about who Lydia cheated with. She never told me who it was or how the affair started. It wasn't just that she cheated and got pregnant that made me angry. It was that she defended the bastard and wouldn't tell me who he was. The only thing she told me was that it only lasted one weekend. Fortunately, I was so busy at work that I didn't have time to think about anything else. I also didn't have time for a social life. There was one officer who worked with me that I became friends with and spent at least one night a week having dinner with him and his family. In my imagination, they were the perfect military family. Husband, wife, 2 kids, 2 cars, and a beautiful home. They had everything. Of course, being a military family, they had to move periodically, pick up their kids from one school and put them in another, and face all the other hardships of military life. Civilian families tend to grow up in the same neighborhood with the same friends over time, but there are exceptions. Families in certain industries, such as oil, move as often or even more often than military families. Anyway, Major George and Marion Johnson seemed perfect, and I loved spending time with them and playing with their children. The son was 10 years old, and the daughter was 8. I don't know what typical children are, but these two looked quite prosperous, so I figured they were typical. One evening after dinner, George and I were talking. TDYs came up and we discussed their pros and cons. Of course, they were necessary and we knew it, but most business trips took us away from our families, those who had them, and we felt we spent enough time away from them to not count as business trips. This topic came up because he was selected to attend a 2-week security seminar at Fort Hood. He was scheduled to leave in 2 weeks. The next day, I went to see our commander. Sir, is there any reason I can't go to the seminar instead of Major Johnson? Not really. The general just decided he had a little more experience in the field than you, but if you go, it'll work out. Good. He and his wife will be celebrating their 12th wedding anniversary, and it would be nice if they celebrated together. Well, Major Sadler, I didn't realize you were a romantic, he said, laughing. 2 weeks later, I was back at Fort Hood, where Lydia and I were living when her daughter was born. Usually military seminars are pretty intense, but this one was relaxed. We were divided into groups of 3 to work on a project. It turned out that there were 6 groups of 3 and there were 2 left. That was the major from Alaska and myself. We developed a close friendship almost immediately. It seemed like we had known each other all our lives. His name was Keith Franklin, and as I said, he was stationed in Alaska at Fort Wainwright, the coldest base in the U.S. Army, but he loved it there. He was a computer genius, and we were so far ahead of everyone else that we had to slow down and wait for them to catch up to us. On Friday of the first week, we had lunch at the O Club. He told me about his personal life. He cheated on his wife and she divorced him. She now lives with some civilian, and his 2 children call the other man daddy. Of all the bad things divorce brings, I've always found it to be the hardest, when your kids call the other man daddy. Toward the end of lunch, I laid out my story too. When I finished, he gave me a strange look in his eyes. And you don't know who the man she was having an affair with is? No, she didn't tell me. And it was here in Hood? Yes. 5 years ago. It's almost 6. Blonde hair and blue eyes? That's what she said. Come with me. We went to the personnel center. Everyone assigned to Fort Hood went through it. We walked right into the personnel director's office. She saw us, stood up, and went around her desk to give Keith a hug. She looked to be about 60 years old, and there was a sparkle in her eyes. I liked her, and I hadn't even talked to her yet. Aunt Lucy, this is Fred Sadler. Hi, Fred, she said, shaking my hand. Hello, Mrs. Healy's nameplate on her desk read. Mrs. Healy, I began. Call me Aunt Lucy. Everyone does. Aunt Lucy, Keith began, do you remember a blonde-haired, blue-eyed officer who may have been here about 6 years ago? She thought for a few seconds. No, but I don't always see everyone who passes through here. They all have to, but that doesn't mean I see them. She thought some more. Fred Sadler? You were here around that time, weren't you? I remember that name. Yes, my wife and I were here, I said. I looked at Kit as if to ask how she remembered it. Kit looked at me. Aunt Lucy has Sam, and she can remember just about anything she's read, seen, or been involved with. That includes people. She can remember everyone she's ever met. Sam? I asked. Yes, superior autobiographical memory. It's a state of mind. Or a curse, Aunt Lucy interrupted. Or a curse, Keith continued. Very few people possess it. Aunt Lucy is Fort Hood's institutional memory, especially when it comes to personnel matters. Isn't that right, Aunt Lucy? Unfortunately, I looked at her, then at Keith, then back at her. Do you remember everything? Everything that happens to me personally? Jesus, I said, how do you have room for all this? We don't. It's just always here. Is there any downside to it? I asked. Oh God, yes. I remember the good as well as the bad. It can cause depression if you let it. I can imagine, I told her. Aunt Lucy, Keith interrupted again. Fred, he pointed at me. He's looking for someone who was here at the same time. The only thing he knows about him is that he was blonde with blue eyes. She laughed. That's it? No height, no weight, no rank, no assignment? Not even his initials? No, ma'am, I said. Calling me ma'am is a waste of good oxygen, Fred. I'm Aunt Lucy. Give me time to think and maybe ask around. Does it matter? Keith looked at me, and I answered. Yes, Aunt Lucy, it matters. Oh, he was about the same age as I was when I was here, if that helps. And he was in the Army, an officer or a private? I suppose he was an officer if he was in the Army. Then you don't even know if he served. No, I don't. Or a civil servant? No, I'm sorry, I know it's not that much. She laughed. There's just nothing to base it on. There can't be more than 2,000 blonde-haired and blue-eyed men I've encountered in the last few years, but I'll see if I can narrow down the time frame. She took both our phone numbers. 2 days later, she called Keith. I was thinking about the man you asked about. I don't remember any blonde-haired and blue-eyed soldiers, officers, or enlisted who were about that age, but I know 2 civilians who work for the Office of Postal Engineers. One of them has been working there for about 30 years, so he's probably too old. The other has been working there for about 10 years. He's in charge of new construction now, but he used to be the head of the plumbing department. His name is Kurt Weber. There are about 15 other blue-eyed blondes, but the ages don't fit, and I didn't bother trying to remember civilians living off base because I assumed that when Major Sadler was here, he didn't have time to make many civilian friends. Keith told me this, and I immediately started planning how to meet Weber, find out if he was the right man, and maybe get a little revenge. The men who prey on the wives of our military personnel are the second lowest form of life on the planet. The lowest, of course, are those who prey on wives when the serviceman is overseas. Those bastards deserve the worst fate imaginable. As I said, Keith could almost read my mind. Let's take a look at this guy, he said. The first thing he did was call Aunt Lucy. Is there any legal way to get Weber's address and phone number? Sure, she answered. I have a civil directory in my desk. 30 seconds later, we had both pieces of information. I love you, Aunt Lucy, Keith told her. We got into his rental car, and at 3:45 p.m., we were waiting outside the main office of the engineer's post office. We recognized him immediately when he came out of the building. He was a good-looking guy, and I hated him at first sight. He headed to his car, and we followed him to make sure he was on his way home. He did. We sat within sight of his house for a couple hours. He never came out, but someone we mistook for his wife was working in the flower bed in the yard, and three kids, all with blonde hair, were playing around it. No, no, no. You don't have to stay here and do this, I said to Keith. Hell, it's fun. I'm sitting here wondering what we can do about this bastard. I've got some ideas. We compared notes. And the next morning, I sat on the next street over from Weber's house in my rental car. I hoped he was golfing or doing homemade crafts, so maybe he was headed to the local hardware or lumber store. I had been sitting there for almost 2 hours when I saw his car pull out of the garage and speed down the street. Thank God, I thought. I didn't feel like sitting here all day to see if he'd gone somewhere, but I was willing to do it if I had to. I followed him to the Home Depot store. We parked and I followed him into the store. He was obviously known there because he talked to several of the employees. There was a spot right in front of the door where there was a coffee urn. I knew enough about Home Depot to know that their regular contractor customers could indulge. Weber helped himself and stood sipping his drink while he chatted with one of the salesmen behind the counter. Watching Mr. Weber, I realized one thing. Not only was he having sex with my wife and getting her pregnant, but he was chewing gum with his mouth open. Other than spitting on the sidewalk, I couldn't think of anything more disgusting. The salesgirl Weber was chatting with needed to help a customer, so Weber took one last sip of coffee, spit the gum into a paper cup, and walked away, unwrapping another piece of gum. I walked over to the trash can, looked in it, and saw a paper coffee cup with a pack of gum in it right on top of it. I looked around, didn't see anyone, and took the cup. I got in my car and called Keith. I told him what I had. He laughed and told me to hurry back, that he might have something bigger by the time I got there. When I pulled up, he was literally jumping from place to place and waving some papers around. "You won't believe this," he said. "You really won't believe it." He grabbed my hand. "Look at this." "No, you better sit down." I did. He sat down next to me and put the papers in front of me. "Now look." There were several names and an address. "So?" asked I. "And so what? It's Hope's name, address, and her family's name. Her name is Sarah now. Sarah Randolph." I hacked into the adoption agency's files. Those files are encrypted better than the nuclear missile launch codes worn by the President of the United States. Then he paused and calmed down. "Well, I didn't personally hack their files. My brother did, but it's the same thing." I started laughing. "That's great, Keith, but what exactly am I going to do about it?" "I have no idea, but you have them. Maybe we can blackmail someone?" "Oh, that's great. I can already see the headlines. 2 Army officers try to blackmail 6-year-old foster child. That's a great one." He tossed the papers on the coffee table and leaned back in his chair. "Yes, I see where you're going with this." He got a little flustered again. "But we cracked their defenses, that's something." "Yeah, that's something," I said, laughing. I carried the papers and coffee cup back to my BOQ, Bachelor Officer's Quarters, and put them on the desk. I have no idea why I did it, but I tracked down the address where Hope lived and drove there early Sunday morning. It was almost 200 miles to Corsicana. The house was a typical suburban house. I sat outside for about an hour watching American suburbia on a typical Sunday. The noise of a few lawnmowers, the screams of children, and the chatter of neighbors. No activity came from Hope's house until almost noon. A car pulled up to the driveway. There were 3 people in the car. A man was behind the wheel. A woman was in the front passenger seat, and a child was in the right rear seat. The woman got out of the car, closed her door, and reached for the right rear door. I was on standby with my cell phone. The woman removed the child from the car seat and placed the child on the ground, then knelt down to straighten the baby's dress. I had just enough time to take a few pictures. I heard a noise next to the car. A woman and her baby were walking by. "Sarah," the baby next to my car squeaked, and she ran to the other baby, who I realized was Hope, and ran to her. They were only a few feet away from my car, and I took a few more quick pictures. I started the car and drove off before either of the 2 women became interested in the strange car and man parked on their street. I drove a short distance away and stopped to look at the pictures. 4 were absolutely perfect. I could even make out her blue eyes. I drove back to Fort Hood. The next week, Keith and I finished the course with ease. We received our diplomas on Friday and then had dinner and a few drinks together. Saturday morning, we went to the airport and flew home. Keith to Alaska, and me to Seattle. The following Monday was a school day, so I had the day off. I took Lydia and Hope Margie's DNA reports to the DNA testing center. She didn't remember me until I reminded her about the pacifier. I gave her Lydia and Hope's DNA results and handed her a coffee cup with gum. "I'll see you in 3 weeks," I said as I left. In fact, it had only been 2. This time she gave me the results over the phone. "It's a married couple, no doubt about it," she said. "Mother, father, and child. She'll send me the official results in the mail." Okay. I had all the information I needed, but what was it for? What am I supposed to do with it? All I needed was to confirm that Weber was, in fact, the guy Lydia cheated with. It took me a week to make the first move. I went to Walmart and bought paper and envelopes. I also made copies of 2 photos of Hope and the DNA reports belonging to Weber, Lydia, and Hope. On the DNA reports, I cut off anything that I could tell where the report came from. I put it all in an envelope. I made sure I had gloves on from the moment I opened the bag of paper and the box of envelopes, made copies of the photos and DNA reports. I even used self-adhesive stamps and water, not saliva, to seal the envelope. I made every effort to make it untraceable. I addressed it to Mrs. Kurt Weber at their home address. I also included Lydia's name and her parents' address because I had no idea where she was. I then drove to the main Seattle post office and dropped the letter in the mailbox. I had no idea what would happen in Killeen, Texas, where Fort Hood and the Weber family are located, when the package arrived. I certainly hoped the package would get to Mrs. Weber and not Mr. Weber. However, I knew what I wanted. I wanted Mrs. Weber to castrate the bastard and then shove his balls down his throat. I felt sorry for the 3 kids I saw, assuming they were his, and of course, Mrs. Weber. But nothing was sorry for Weber himself. He must rot in hell. The news from Killeen was a little over a month ago. Aunt Lucy called me. "I'm going to ask you a question and I want an honest answer," she said. "I'm going to do my best. Anything you do isn't good enough. I need complete honesty. Is that what you and Keith did with Weber?" "Aunt Lucy, I don't mean to sound smart, but what did we do to him?" "Set him up so his wife would file for divorce." "Okay, that's what I did. Keith had nothing to do with it." I told her the truth. Most of it, anyway. I omitted Keith's part. I figured if anyone was going to get in trouble, it would be me. "You certainly stirred up a hornet's nest. Apparently, when his wife received your package, she didn't know if the DNA was his or someone else's, so she did it herself. She took some of his DNA and sent it off for processing. She also sent the profiles of that woman and the child. They matched, and that's where it all went downhill. Who was the woman he was flirting with?" "It was my wife, Aunt Lucy." "Oh my God. I thought it might be something like that. They brought him into the office yesterday and he wasn't thrilled. He was ranting and raving all over the base." "Good. Hearing from you that his marriage is over is the best news I've heard in a while. I just feel sorry for his family." It was over for me. Lydia and I were divorced and Weber was on the road to divorce. I put all the papers Keith had given me into a folder and put it in a box with other things I no longer needed, but still kept. My life went on as normal. Over the next few months, I went on a couple dates, but nothing much happened. I still spent a lot of time with George and Marion Johnson. I lived in an apartment and sometimes took them out to dinner, but more often I had dinner at their house and spent more than one night on their couch. I had 1 more year of service left at Fort Lewis and was thinking about buying a house, but the Army had other ideas. They sent me to the Command College of the General Staff, C&GS, at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. I was there for almost a year. There were a lot of opportunities for socializing there. If you were married, or if you had a significant other. Otherwise, the choices were pretty sparse. It was a long but interesting year. After graduation, I returned to Fort Hood. I was surprised because I expected to be sent overseas like 90% of my classmates. Once at Hood, I found myself in Aunt Lucy's office. "How did you get back here?" she asked. "I have no idea." "I do," came a voice from the past. It was newly promoted Lieutenant Colonel LTC Keith Franklin. He walked into the office, closed the door, and we shook hands. It turned out I needed an assistant, and a major who had just graduated from C, and GS was just what I needed. So I asked him. Now, Keith and I had talked a few times since we arrived at the seminar, but hadn't seen each other. I was glad to see my friend. After registering, I took 2 weeks vacation. The first thing I did was to look for a house. Lydia and I had been saving up money to buy one. I assumed she would get half of it in the divorce, but since she didn't show up in court, I got everything. I went to the First National Bank of Texas branch in Fort Hood and opened an account. I also arranged to have my money transferred to that bank. I told the employee helping me that I also needed to find a house. Just as I said this, the branch manager walked by. He introduced himself as Dwight Randolph. We moved here about 6 months ago and settled in a brand new neighborhood. The houses are very nice and inexpensive. You get a lot of value for your money. Having said that, he went to his office and came back with a business card from the agent he used. Saying that, I decided that if she was good enough for the bank branch manager, she was good enough for me. I called her, and it only took me 3 days to find what I wanted. I paid more than half of the down payment, and the bank was happy to finance the rest. So I started working with Keith and moved into my new home. The first things I bought were a bed, a chair, and a big TV, and a lawnmower. I spent my first night in my new house. It was already dark outside, and I had no curtains or drapes. There weren't even enough sheets to cover the big front window. I had just opened a beer and was holding a slice of pepperoni pizza in my hand when the doorbell rang. I had long since gotten off the no red meat diet that Lydia had me on. I opened the door, and there stood a woman. "Hello, neighbor," she said. "My name is Samantha Randolph, but everyone calls me Sammy. We live in this neighborhood. We haven't lived here long ourselves, and I just wanted to say hello, introduce myself, and tell you that if you need anything, just ask. Is your wife here?" I smiled. "Fred Sadler. No wife. Divorced." I saw her frown. "But don't worry. I don't throw loud, wild parties or even soft wild parties." She smiled. We chatted for a few more minutes before she left. The first week in my new home flew by. On Saturday morning, 3 women rang the doorbell and brought food. They also brought decorating ideas. They had seen my empty house with lights on at night and me sitting in it with nothing but a chair, TV, beer, and pizza. They decided it was time to help me out. The instigator was Sammy Randolph. A couple hours later, I had a slightly worn but nice leather couch, a dining table and chairs, and a small coffee table to keep the pizza from lying on the floor. The ladies were about to leave when 3 small children ran into the room, chasing each other. One of the ladies, Ruth, grabbed 2 of them, and Sammy grabbed the third. "Calm down, Sarah." She knelt down beside the child and flicked her blonde hair back from her blue eyes. "This is our new neighbor, Major Sadler." "Hello," she said confidently. "My name is Sarah." I leaned toward her. "Hi, Sarah," I said, looking into her piercing blue eyes. Blonde hair and blue eyes. I shook my head. "How old are you, Sarah?" "Soon to be 7. I stood up and we all said our goodbyes. As soon as they left, I went to the room that was going to be my den, found the right box, opened it, and pulled out a folder. In it were the pictures I had taken. It was the same baby. I hadn't paid attention to the names of the adoptive parents before, but now I did. The adoption papers listed Dwight and Samantha Randolph as Hope's foster parents. I literally fell on my butt and just sat there. What were the odds? He was the assistant manager of another bank branch in Corsicana, Texas, and then he was promoted and transferred to Killeen and Fort Hood. It was freaking weird. No computer could have calculated the likelihood of that happening. Sammy and her friend mostly decorated my house. It took a few weeks, and when it was done, we had a neighborhood open house. Sammy invited her sister-in-law, Joni Payne, who happened to be divorced. I hadn't enjoyed female companionship in a long time. Joni and I hit it off right away. She was the last one to leave the party, and I couldn't wait to call her the next day. We met for lunch and had dinner with Dwight, Sammy, and Sarah. Sarah wasn't there because she wanted to go play with her friends. Over the next few months, we were together as often as possible. The first night we spent together was a very good night. We were sitting at the kitchen island when the doorbell rang. I threw on my robe and went to open it. It was Sammy. "Good afternoon, Fred," she said as she came inside. "We were wondering," she saw Joni. "Well, what do we have here?" she asked, heading toward her sister-in-law. Joni was sitting on a stool eating a ham and cheese sandwich. As Sammy approached her, she set the sandwich aside and turned to face her sister-in-law. Her robe was open, and Sammy reached up to close it. Joni laughed. It's too late to be modest, sis. He's already seen everything. What's more, he's— Never mind, Sammy said. Spare me the details. Anyway, we were wondering if you, Fred, and while you're here, you, Joni, would like to go to the mall. Fred, I know you still need a few things for the house. Yes, like that awful bedspread, Joni added. What's wrong with that bedspread? I picked it out myself. That's what's wrong, Joni said, as she stood up and kissed Sammy on the cheek. I left the room and went upstairs to get dressed. When I came back, they were still discussing my bedspread. When they saw that I was dressed, they fell silent. We'd love to go to the mall, I said. If we can get Joni to get dressed. A few minutes later, she came downstairs in the clothes she'd worn to dinner last night. If this keeps up, I'll have to leave my clothes here. I can't go shopping in clothes like this. You can tonight, I said, ushering her out of the house. Dwight was as surprised as Sammy when he saw his sister walking out of my house. Don't ask, Sammy said. Dwight and I sat in the front with the two women and Sarah in the back. Joni was reading a book to Sarah, who was already asleep when we arrived at the mall. When we returned in the evening, I drove Joni home. She invited me to have a nightcap and eat a piece of ass. I accepted her offer. The next weekend, Dwight and Sammy asked Joni to watch Sarah while the two of them went out to dinner. We were in the backyard watching Sarah in her sandbox. Without looking at Joni, I said, She's a beautiful child, isn't she? Yes, did you know she was adopted? Did you? Yes. They've had her since she was born. According to the adoption agency, the birth mother was married, had an affair with a man she doesn't even remember, and got pregnant. Her husband was in the military. She didn't want him to find out about her affair, so she gave Sarah up for adoption. Dwight and Sammy were there to take her home. Sarah was the name her own mother gave her? No, her name was Hope. It's on the birth certificate, but Sammy and Dwight changed it. Sarah suits her better. What happened to the birth mother and her husband? I have no idea. The adoption agency is closing their cases very tightly. They don't give the birth mother access to information about the adoptive family, and vice versa. Sarah walked over and wanted to sit on Joni's lap. She leaned her head on Joni's lap and fell asleep almost immediately. A few minutes later, Joni asked me to carry Sarah into the bedroom and put her to bed. It was my first time touching her, and I felt very uncomfortable. I happily tucked her in. 7 months later, Joni moved in with me. A year after that, we were married. We lived a very happy year until the army intervened. We were told we were being sent to Germany for 3 years of service. We had 60 days to get there. One of the things the government does well is move people, and we ended up in the country with all of our possessions, including my car, in the allotted time. Germany is a beautiful country, and the area around Heidelberg is gorgeous. Joni had never traveled outside of the United States, so she enjoyed the adventure and traveling around Europe. One of the first things we did was buy a new car. She was over the moon, rushing down the freeways as fast as she wanted in a car built for high speeds. We took 2 trips to the States, one when her father and Dwight's father died. The other was for a reunion. Both times, of course, we saw Dwight and Sammy. We saw Sarah at the funeral, but when we went back for the reunion, she was at camp. I breathed a sigh of relief. Sarah and I had never gotten along. I guess some internal mechanism told us both that we weren't going to be friends. I was fine with that. I understood that she had no say in her birth and didn't know who her parents were. But in my mind, she was still the child of my ex-wife and her lover. Joni and I tried to have children, but we never got to that point. We also talked about adoption, but things never got very far. Keith and I remained friends and talked from time to time. He remarried, and while Joni and I were in Germany, he was stationed in Belgium and we visited each other. More than once, he and I discussed the fantastic turns of events that had led us to where we ended up, and he blamed it all on himself. If he hadn't gotten his brother to hack into the adoption agency, we wouldn't have known who or where Hope was. 3 years later, we received orders to go to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I was traveling as a new lieutenant assigned to the post headquarters as an executive officer under the post commander. This was normally a position for a colonel, not a junior lieutenant colonel, but I didn't mind. In the military world, you don't look a gift horse in the mouth. Joni and I decided to live in government quarters while we served there. Our house in Killeen was rented out, and we decided to continue to do so. To help me settle in, the staff organized a series of briefings with representatives from the various departments that support the post. One of the briefings was to be given by the postal engineer. Representatives from that department, as well as the postal engineer himself, were already in the conference room when I arrived. I sat down in my seat at the table and watched as the blue-eyed citizen stood up to begin his speech. His hair was slightly blonde, but with a hint of gray. He introduced himself as Kurt Weber. I just stared at him. He had been talking for an hour, and I hadn't heard a word he said, and my gaze didn't take my eyes off his face. It was obvious that he was uncomfortable with me looking at him. At the end of his speech, he asked if I had any questions. "Tell me, Mr. Weber, have you ever been to Fort Hood?" "Yes, sir. I was in the engineering department." "Did you like it there?" "Yes, sir." "Why did you leave?" "That's rather personal, sir." "You're right. I'll withdraw the question. I'd just like to know about the people I work with. I seem to recall a scandal in the engineering department at Fort Hood a few years ago. Do you know anything about it?" "I vaguely recall something about one. Someone was cheating there, if I remember correctly." Well, I just remembered something. Thanks for the briefing. If you need anything at HQ, feel free to contact me. Just in case you forgot." I pointed to the name tag on my uniform. "My name is Sadler. Fred Sadler. I wouldn't want you to forget it." I still looked him straight in the eyes and saw the light bulb go on in them, and the eyes become huge. Kurt Weber became several different colors, from red to pale gray. I got up and left. And in the afternoon, I learned that Mr. Kurt Weber had requested a transfer. Unfortunately for him, this request had to go through me. When I received it the next day, I wrote in large letters "Answer" and added a handwritten note. "I have plans that involve Mr. Weber's expertise. He will play a key role in bringing these plans to fruition." The next day, to the surprise of almost everyone, Mr. Kurt Weber submitted his immediate resignation. I signed it. Every day I fell more and more in love with Joni. I watched her become more and more beautiful and sexy. Every morning I looked in the mirror and all I saw was an aging middle-aged man, and I wondered what she saw in me. But whatever it was, I was grateful for it. We enjoyed our time together, and time in the form of years flew by quickly, much faster than I wanted it to. We were serving in Alaska and came to Killeen to visit Sammy and Dwight. The first night they initiated us into the decision they had made for Sarah, who was now almost 18 years old. She had known from the beginning that she was adopted, but was now interested in trying to find her biological parents. Dwight and Sammy supported her decision, but the adoption agency gave them no help, saying they had to follow the laws. All we heard that first day was how archaic the laws were and that they needed to be reformed, especially considering how important it is for an adopted child to know the health status of the birth parents. They decided to go to a website dedicated to DNA and ancestral origins, send in Sarah's DNA, and see what happens. Sarah thought it would be great to have her birth mother attend her high school graduation, but since it was only a couple weeks away, they decided that was unlikely. That evening, Joni and I were already in bed when she asked, "What are you going to do?" "About what?" "About Sarah." "What about her?" "Oh, come on, Fred. Married couples don't have secrets, or shouldn't have any. I found your file 6 months after we were married. She can avoid DNA testing if you tell them everything you know." "Oh shit," I said. "Yeah, oh shit. Why have you kept quiet all these years?" "I'm not sure. I guess I knew how sensitive you'd be about it, and Dwight and Sammy didn't need to know, so I kept quiet." "And now?" "But now it's become important and you need to address it." "Any suggestions on how I can do that?" "Just tell the story, I suppose." "How do you think they'll take it?" "Dwight is my brother and just like me, so he'll take it normally. Sammy is the dark horse." "Good. We'll pick Sarah up from the house tomorrow and tell them." She leaned over and kissed me gently. "Do I ever bore you?" she asked. "What a stupid question," I said. "Of course you haven't. Why did you even ask it?" "Because you haven't touched me all day." I grinned and reached for the buttons on her pajamas. "I can fix that right now." The next morning was Sunday. Sarah was picked up by her best friend and they headed to the mall. I gathered the four of us around the table, took a deep breath, and began. I started by telling them that Joni and I had packed our stuff before we even came downstairs, so we were ready if they wanted to kick us out. They looked at us, and Joni shrugged. Sarah doesn't need to give her DNA in case she finds her birth parents. I know who they are, I said. The looks I got from both of them told me it was best to explain myself, so I told them the whole story. When I finished, I took a deep breath and looked around the table. Dwight just stared at me, and Sammy had tears in her eyes. After a few seconds, she stood up, walked over to me, took my hands, pulled me to her, and hugged me. Oh, you poor guy. Living with that all these years and not being able to talk about it. No one deserves that. She hugged me again. What do you think, Dwight? She asked her husband. 7. I'm trying to calculate the odds of how we all ended up together. I don't think it's going to turn out to be a big enough number. So what do we do now? Sammy asked, returning to her chair. I think Fred should contact his ex-wife and invite her to the prom since Sarah wants her there, said Joni. Me? Why me? I protested. Because you started it. Dwight smirked. But who's going to contact Weber? Not me, I said, and told them about the last time I'd seen him. You never told me that, Joni said. I didn't think you knew the whole story, did you? She leaned over and kissed me. I love this woman, I thought. Later that day, when Sarah returned, Dwight and Sammy told her about it. She was both nervous and excited and wanted us to continue. The only way I know of to contact Lydia is through her parents. If they're still alive. And if they still live in Mechanicsburg. And if they still had a landline. So I waited until Monday morning and talked to a private investigator. I asked him to help me find Lydia and Kurt Weber's parents. It took him 2 hours to get the parents' phone number. It took Weber a little longer. I called Lydia's parents, reminded them who I was, and told them I needed to talk to Lydia. I gave them my phone number to give to her. Not an hour later, my phone rang. Hello? This is Lydia Bowman. I was given this number. Hello, Lydia? Fred? Yes, how are you? I asked, trying to think of something clever to say, but I couldn't. Actually, I'm doing great. How are you? Pretty good. Lydia, I need to talk to you about something very important. Okay, talk. Just not over the phone. Tell me where we can meet and we'll talk in person. Explain it to me. We haven't spoken in years, and suddenly out of the blue you have something so important that it needs to be discussed in person? Exactly. I'm sorry, Fred. I'm not buying it. Okay, but remember I gave you a chance. A chance at what? Come on, Fred. What's the matter? Just in person, Lydia. Call me if you change your mind. Wait, okay, goddammit. We live in Vegas. That's better. I'm flying out there tomorrow and I'll call you when I land. Decide where you want to meet. The next day, we met in the lobby of the Bellagio Hotel. Apparently, she needed a lot of witnesses. Hi, Lydia. Hi, Fred. This is my husband, Roland. Roland Bowman. Hi, Roland. I turned my attention back to Lydia. I need to speak to you privately for 10 seconds. Yeah. Anything you have to say, you can say in front of Roland. Whatever you say, it's about the hope you had. She turned pale. Can we talk some more? Yes, he knows about her. Good, let's sit down. We found as quiet a corner as we could, given where we were. I recommend something to drink. Wine will do? We agreed to a red, and I ordered it. Let's wait while we get some poured into our glasses. I paid for the wine and we all took a sip. Her name is Sarah, she's graduating in 2 weeks and would like you to be there. Roland and I watched her pass out with a glass of wine in her hand without spilling a drop. Roland took the glass from her, set it down, and patted her cheeks until she regained consciousness. What did you say? I repeated. Then I pulled out a picture of Sarah and showed it to Lydia. She started crying, touching the picture as gently as she could. She's beautiful. Where did you get her? I took a picture of her yesterday in her living room. Photographed it? How? Why? I told her the whole story from beginning to end. I even told her that we had tried to find Kurt Weber to invite him, but he seemed to have disappeared. She didn't realize I knew his name and was shocked a second time. She was stunned at first, but then she got angry, really angry. Why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you keep her from me all these years? Her voice grew louder and louder. Roland jumped to his feet. Calm down, calm down. You gave up all rights to her. Fred is breaking the law by doing what he's doing now, so calm down. She calmed down. When can I see her? At her graduation if you want to come. Of course I'll come. Can I see her before then? You both need time to get used to it. Take your time. How about coming the day before? She smiled. That would be great. How about I take a picture of you so she can see what you look like? Okay. We found a spot outside for her to pose. When I started to leave, she rushed over to me, hugged me, and started kissing all over my face and head. Not too demonstrative, is it? Roland asked, laughing. I decided I liked him. That same afternoon, I flew back to get Sarah ready. I showed her a picture of Lydia. She's beautiful, said Sarah. She was very nervous, but excited at the same time. For the first time in the time I'd known her, she hugged me. Thank you, Uncle Fred. Now we know where you get your beauty, Sammy said, snuggling up tightly against Sarah. Do you know what my birth father looks like? Sarah asked timidly. Asked Sarah timidly. Asked Sarah timidly. Asked Sarah timidly. The other three adults looked at me with widened eyes, waiting to see what I would say. I thought for a second before I spoke. Let me just say that you got your blonde hair and blue eyes from him. The three adults breathed a sigh of relief. We had only taken a week's vacation, so I had to go back to Alaska, but Joni stayed behind to help everyone prepare for the big day. I left for Alaska, promising to return 2 days before graduation. The day before I was supposed to return to Killeen, I got a call from a private investigator. The most he had been able to find out about Weber was that, after leaving government service, he had taken a job as a consultant to the government of a Middle Eastern country. Like several other American consultants, he disappeared shortly after arriving in-country and has not been seen since. I met Lydia and Roland at the airport and drove them directly to Sarah's house. When we entered, she was standing in the middle of the living room. I let Lydia pass in front of me. They looked at each other for a long time, then Lydia spoke. I brought you this, she said, pulling out a pacifier. It belongs to you, and I thought you might want it back. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.